Hey, Uncle Mark.
Hi.
When last we left our Mormon heroes,
Yes.
they were in peril as their brave leader had pepperboxed his way to heaven.
That's
They
right.
they were pretty much all the way dead was what had happened there. So that's the end of Mormonism, I guess, right, Doug?
That's
It
the end
ended
of that. Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Last week was kind of the Empire Strikes Back of the Mormon origin story, where the hero and his crew were laid low. And today I thought we could talk about the second half of that inciting incident of the modern Mormon religion.
Yeah.
And dear uncles, for those unlucky enough not to be living in the pretty great state of Utah, I'll get sick of that joke someday. But
pretty great state.
For the 9 people who think it's funny, I'm one of them.
That was a tremendously famous marketing misfire by our friends at the state of Utah a few years back.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
For those people, July 24th is just a normal summer day, but for those of us fortunate enough to call the state of Deseret our home, July 24th is a major state holiday marked by parades, fireworks, and, of course, closed liquor stores.
Yes.
Yes.
It marks the anniversary of the day Brigham Young led his weary followers out of the mouth of the coincidentally named Emigration Canyon into the Great Salt Lake Valley and declared...
That was a piece of luck, wasn't it?
and declared, "This is the place." So last week we covered the death of Joseph and Hiram, and today in part 2, I'd like to talk about how a Protestant sect born in New England and forged into metal on the banks of the Mississippi River became a desert religion inextricably linked to the Rocky Mountain state of Utah. Today, let's talk about the great Mormon migration that has become the much exaggerated origin story of the modern LDS Church.
Yes.
So,
The Exodus, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Very
Yes.
much so. So, as we discussed last week, the Mormons had met, let's say, with less than hospitable circumstances in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois, culminating in an angry mob murdering their prophet in 1844. We covered the power struggle that ensued and how Brigham Young became the leader of that fractured church back in episode 77. But just to recap, Joseph Smith had left no instructions on who should succeed him.
Incorrect. He had left instructions that were then ignored.
Well, that's true.
by the Brighamites.
Right.
His instructions were that his son was going to be the...
Hey, I really appreciate you not correcting me on the show.
Incorrect!
Yeah. His son who was, what, 14?
It was a child. Yeah,
He was like
a
12,
child.
yeah.
So
But that didn't stop an entire offshoot to
making him their guy.
making him their guy.
That's right.
and becoming the other
Yep.
Mormons.
And
Yeah.
there's Strangites and Rigdonites that all broke off at the time, but the vast majority followed Brigham.
Yeah.
So Brigham had convinced the vast majority of Mormons he was their guy and would lead his church would lead the church until his death in 1877. He is by far the longest-serving president of the church and is often referred to as the Mormon Paul. Since most of the actual doctrine and culture of Mormonism came from him rather than Joseph, I think it's just as apt to call him the Mormon Stalin, since his long reign was marked by violence, repression, and fear.
I like to call him the Mormon Miscavige.
Yeah. You're both right. They all apply. Yeah.
Well, today we'll talk about how he gained the nickname of American Moses. So back in episode 44, which was almost exactly a year ago, can you believe it? I think we should turn the 24th of July into a tradition where we talk about some chapter of the Mormon pioneer story.
I don't see how we could avoid it.
So the first Mormon pioneers who came and settled in the Salt Lake Valley is the subject of our talk today. So even before Joseph was killed, the Mormons were eyeing the West and had been discussing the possible relocation of the saints outside of the country that had treated them so badly. And although the Mormons definitely had a role in the bad blood that existed between them and, well, everybody, the violence that was directed at the Mormons was often carried out on women and children and is a stain on American history, albeit a very small stain on a particularly large and dirty garment. So, and remember,
Like
it was
Baltimore.
literally... That's right. Exactly. It was literally legal to kill Mormons at this time in Missouri.
Wow.
That was on the books. So
Yeah, there was an extermination order.
that's right. So, however, the Mormons had been forced out of several states before finally turning what was a swampy bend in the Mississippi River in Illinois into their own capital city of Nauvoo. They had invested heavily in the city and were loath to leave, partly because they knew they would only recoup pennies on the dollar from their neighbors. They knew this because it had happened to them already in their many forced migrations. By the time the Mormons decided to leave Nauvoo, it was nearly the size of Chicago in Illinois. It was a huge city.
Not current Chicago.
No, not
Chicago. Chicago then.
Okay, you're still getting a little on my back over here. Get all the way off my back. But the death of Joseph and Hiram did not end the violence and hostility towards the saints, and so Brigham made the decision that the United States was no place for Mormons and began looking for a new home out west. He specifically wanted land that nobody else wanted because pretty much every time a Mormon had a neighbor, one of them ended up dead. So Brigham consulted with trappers, mountain men, and Jesuit missionaries and settled on a specific valley in the Great Basin. It was remote enough that they could set up their own nation, and the surrounding mountains would act as both a defense and a source of fresh water. So the Mormons began making plans for this trek in 1845 and 1846. As you might imagine, uprooting well over 10,000 people, disposing of all their property, and securing enough oxen, wagons, and supplies to move them 1,500 miles was quite an undertaking. It should be mentioned here that Brigham Young was not a creative man, but he was an organized one.
Yeah.
He had a knack for logistics, matched only by his lust for poontang. Had Joseph been the one to lead the
Is that a word
saints,
we use?
poontang?
Yeah.
You know what?
Okay.
It's in my notes. It's not being corrected by the computer, so it's a real word.
There you go.
You spelled it properly is what you're saying.
I did on the first try, which is crazy for me.
Can I quickly inject a point of order?
Yeah.
Do you guys remember? Were you guys taught this? Because you just revealed that Brigham actually had people scout out places for him and talk to him about where they might go.
I know where you're going with this. Yep.
I was not
do I.
taught that as
No.
a young Mormon boy. I was taught that he had a dream
Right.
and that he was being led by the Lord, and there
Right.
was no planning. They just headed west
Yep.
and magically ended up exactly where he needed to be.
Yeah. Exactly.
And at the crest of every valley, at the crest of every mountain, they'd look into that valley hoping this was the place.
Yep.
And it wasn't until they got to, just above 23rd East there that
Right.
he finally said, I was taught that they had no foreknowledge, which is utter bullshit.
Utter bullshit. It would be also extraordinarily irresponsible.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I wouldn't put past him, but it would be deeply stupid. Because
that's not how you get to Salt Lake City, Utah. That's how you get to Blaine, Missouri.
That's right.
So it also bears mentioning that although this was the largest migration of a single group of people, this occurred during the height of westward expansion and manifest destiny. So again, when we were young, we were taught that this was kind of a unique chapter in American history,
Yes.
when that is not at all the case.
Right.
That there were
Nobody
no-
was going west.
Right.
That there were no other pioneers ever.
Right. People
Right.
were moving west by the tens of thousands.
Right.
The most were stopping short and homesteading in the Great Plains or heading all the way to California or Oregon.
Yeah.
But
Because you'd have to be an idiot to come to here.
exactly.
This place was a fucking barren desert.
Very much so.
Yes, you can imagine genius Brigham Young saying, "I want to be by a body of water, but it must be dead. It must
Right,
be
yeah.
useless to us and hot
Yeah.
as balls."
And hopefully if you drink it, you'll die. Did you
Yeah.
have one of those?
A poison lake.
Yes. What do you
yeah,
have in a
and by-
lake but poisonous?
By the end of the 19th century, some 7 million people had trekked west. So
Yeah.
Holy shit.
the
And
Mormon
it-
migration is
right,
part
it-
of that story, but only a part.
In 1849, it was about to explode, right? With
Yeah.
the California gold rush.
Exactly. So in the winter of 1846 and 7, Brigham had set up a camp on the Missouri River, which he imaginatively named Winter Quarters. This would be the jumping off point for all the expeditions that would follow. And in April of 1847, the Vanguard expedition set out. The Vanguard Company would break trail, try and establish fords and ferries over the many rivers they would have to cross, and they even planted crops that later companies could harvest on their journey. This first party consisted of 143 men, including 3 slaves, also something not taught to us when we were kids.
Yes.
Yeah.
3 women and 2 children. Brigham was among the ranks, as were others that to our ex-Mormon listeners will surely recognize, like John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, Erastus Snow, Heber C. Kimball, and Wilford Woodruff. Many of these guys would go on to be prophets of the church in their own right.
There were only 2 children in the entire company? That's
In
weird.
that first company, yeah.
Huh.
And the only reason they brought 3 women, weirdly, is for
Saturday night.
yeah, right. Erastus Snow's wife was sick, so he didn't want to leave her, and they brought 2 other women to tend to her, and that's the only reason there are any women, which is kind of weird.
Still, helped for Saturday night.
Exactly.
I love that. My wife is sick, so the best remedy is for her to walk
Fucking
2,000 miles across the wilderness.
Exactly. So the company was also made up of 73 wagons, 1 cannon, 93 horses, 52 mules, 66 oxen, 19 cows, 17 dogs, and an unknown number of chickens. So,
God damn it! I need to know.
They counted everything but the chickens. So
That could be 1 million. It could have been mostly chickens. That seems an irresponsible oversight. I'm sorry, Brigham's
right.
stock is plummeting.
They walked from 7 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. every day except Sunday, and averaged between 14 and 20 miles, especially during the plains part of the walk. Mm-hmm. Crazy side note, and Dan, you know this, a guy named William Clayton was tasked with calculating how far they traveled each day. He did this at first by counting the revolutions of a wagon wheel and then calculating that out at the end of the day.
Right.
That's fun. So surprisingly, he got a little tired of that, and he and Orson Pratt designed a mechanism that used wooden cogwheels to count the revolutions for them. Don't ask me how it worked. I tried to figure it out, but in true pioneer spirit, gave up after a few minutes and turned on Netflix. The design is the thing that they dubbed the rodometer, and is what most modern odometers are actually based on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They invented that.
Yeah.
Really?
That was pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
For the first leg of the trek, the Mormons broke
They
their
can
own
count the
track.
wagon wheel rotations, but they can't count chickens. Okay, fair.
All I'm saying is all of it was worth it for the odometer, right?
I like my odometer. On the first
What
leg,
would I
the
do
Mormons-
without my odometer?
Exactly. The Mormons kind of broke their own trail at first because they didn't want to go along the more populated Oregon Trail in order to avoid inevitable bloodshed. But
And dying of diphtheria. What did you die of when you played Oregon Trail?
Oh, that's
right.
right.
Dysentery. You have died of dysentery.
That's right. When they got to Fort Laramie, they went ahead and took the Oregon Trail by that point, and they were joined by some smaller groups of Mormons in the area and some of the Mormon Battalion, which we'll talk about some other time. Along the way, they met trapper Jim Bridger, who was at first very friendly to the Mormons and gave them advice how to get through the Wasatch Mountains to the Salt Lake Valley. However, over time, Bridger would sour on the Mormons because of their treatment of the local Indians. Please see the above-mentioned references to Mormons and neighbors. Bridger would have a very interesting part to play in the Mormon-Utah War of 1857, which contributed to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which we talked about in episode 51. Also a story for another day. Just a quick note on the Native Americans in that area. The area was inhabited, obviously, mostly by sub-tribes of the southern Paiutes, Utes, and Shoshones. Mm-hmm. Weirdly, and definitely unbeknownst to Brigham, the Salt Lake Valley was at the time kind of a demilitarized zone between the Utes and the Shoshones, who were at war.
Huh.
Yeah. But the whole rest of the area was inhabited, and the Mormons treated them with the same casual genocidal attitude that everybody else did.
Yeah.
Now I just want to see Mormons move into all the demilitarized zones. Just
Go to the DMZ, fuckers.
The North and South Koreans just watching in bafflement as a bunch of Mormons show up and start setting up shop in their little... Anyway,
Just
go on.
one strip mall from end to end across the Korean peninsula.
As they made their final push to the mountain passes, many members of the group took sick with mountain fever. Probably caused by wood ticks. Brigham himself became very ill and made the last leg of the journey bedridden. Finally, on July 21st, Erastus Snow and Orson Pratt were the first two Mormons to enter the Salt Lake Valley. They did a brief reconnoiter and immediately began diverting water from what would be called City Creek and planted potatoes and turnips. Yum.
Yeah.
Days later, on July 24th... Go ahead, sorry.
No. Okay. I didn't realize they did that before Brigham arrived.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. On July 24th, a few days later, Brigham Young entered the valley and spoke the immortal words, "This is the right place, drive on."
Yes. And who was driving? Who was driving, by the way?
Heber C. Kimball, actually.
Well, wasn't it Green Flake?
Green Flake.
I think Green Flake was driving Brigham's wagon. He was his slave.
Well, it certainly doesn't say that on the monument.
No.
Well, it also doesn't say this is the right place on the monument.
I know, right? And the drive on.
The monument says this is the place, and everybody thinks he says this is the place.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good thing Brigham Young wasn't the first man to walk on the moon. Yeah, we're here. For contrast, can I just read you Mark Twain's first words upon seeing the Salt Lake Valley? Quote, "All the world was glorified with the setting sun, and the most stupendous panorama of mountain peaks yet encountered burst into our sight. We looked out upon the sublime spectacle from under the arch of a brilliant rainbow. Now that's how you sell a motherfucking valley, yo.
and then he wrote about the Mormons, and things went very much downhill from there.
Exactly. We should talk about that.
And then he met
sometime.
Brigham Young, and it was over.
Yeah, it did not go well.
Yeah.
So the Mormons immediately began laying out the city and planting crops. Brigham and many of the company did not stay long, leaving to return to winter quarters in August to lead more companies west. By December of 1847, more than 2,000 Mormons had made the trek. So,
Wow.
once in Salt Lake, Brigham immediately dispatched groups to explore and settle anywhere there was water, which was not a dumb strategy, as whoever controlled the water controlled the land.
Right.
This led to Mormons settling most of the current cities in Utah, like Cedar City, Manti, Ogden, St. George, but also to Mormons settling southwest cities like Las Vegas and San Bernardino, California, among others.
Yeah.
Yeah. The end of the Mormon migration period is generally thought to have ended with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, although, as we've discussed, some Mormon immigrants were still so poor they had to make the overland trek after the railroad's completion.
Yeah,
So,
with their fucking hand carts. Unbelievable.
Yep. But in that period of time, about 70,000 Mormons made the trek across Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah, and then on to whatever settlement Brigham Young demanded they go to. Brigham's dream of an independent sovereign nation based on the noble principles of polygamy, slavery, and himself was as grandiose as it was short-lived. For a laugh, listeners should Google the map of Brigham Young's original idea of the state of Deseret.
Yeah, the Empire of Deseret.
Yeah, it encompasses all of Utah and Nevada, most of Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Oregon, Wyoming, Idaho, and California, including the seaport of San Diego. So that's kind of that's at least the end of that part of the story. So the Mormons, that was the first trek west. Brigham and his crew were the first ones to enter the valley. But for a fun little coda on this, there is actually a 1940 film called Brigham Young, directed by Henry Hathaway, same guy who directed the original True Grit and How the West Was Won. This movie stars Dean Jagger as Brigham Young, John Carradine, father of David Carradine, as Porter Rockwell, kind of the coolest character in the movie.
Yeah, by far.
And Vincent Price as Joseph Smith.
Shut the fuck up. I did not know that.
I did not know it until I was watching it. I'm like, is that Vincent Price?
Younger listeners might not know who Vincent Price was, but he was this gloriously wonderful villainous character. You know, actor always played these amazing villains, right?
Yeah.
And so this is right in keeping with that pattern.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
It's a old black and white movie. It's epic in the scale of the time when, you know, they didn't really care how many horses they killed in production.
No. Yeah.
And it's not good. It's wildly historically inaccurate. But watching Vincent Price get shot out the window as Joseph Smith is pretty funny. The pratfall is pretty hilarious.
I love how gay his portrayal of Joseph Smith must have been.
It's so gay. And the only place I could find this movie to watch the other day was on an RU website, so I'm sure my computer's a bot farm now.
Yeah, exactly.
But for you, dear listeners, I endured. So, yeah, there it is. This is the place.
I'll be damned. Well,
And a few years, just a few years after that, 3 audio uncles were to meet and say, "This is the podcast."
indeed.
Yeah.
We'll have to have our next meetup at the This Is the Place State Park.
Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty grim up there.
Thank you, Uncle Doug. Let us move onward.
Forward.